Leaders Talk, the interview podcast portraying leaders who are committed to better leadership, better organizations, and a better world. Powered by Leadership Choices.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Leaders Talk, the biographical interview podcast for better leadership, better organizations, and a better world. My name is Carsten Draht, and I am one of the managing partners of Leadership Choices. Today, we want to bring to you a very special format, and this is a conference, a virtual conference that we held a couple of weeks back, a roundtable on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in that roundtable, we featured a couple of different companies like SAP, like Coca-Cola, like Sodexo, and many others, and their best practices in dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to integrate that into a corporate culture. In today's episode, my colleague Prajna Paramita interviews Dr.Rohini Anand, who is the former CHRO and Chief Diversity Officer of Sodexo, a global organization, a truly global organization with over 400,000 employees at one point in time, how they improved from a laggard in the field to a leader in the field in about a decade. So it's very interesting for everybody to listen who is leading organization or who is actually interested in improving in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their particular environment. And without further ado, let's jump right into the conference, the Roundtable, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, featuring Dr. Rohini Anand.
A very warm welcome extended to all of you who are here. I'm Paramita, and I have the privilege on behalf of Leadership Choices to have this fireside chat with our guest, Dr. Rohini Anand. To most of you who are leaders or consultants in diversity, equity, and inclusion, her name really needs no introduction. It's definitely going to ring a bell, as she's a thought leader in this field. And she's also the author of a recently acclaimed book called Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This is based on her almost 2 decades as the CDO of Sodexo, Chief Diversity Officer. Carsten mentioned her recent podcast in the series Leaders Talk. And in this conversation, she has shared her leadership journey in which her personal and professional journeys are beautifully intertwined. But today we will concern ourselves with the bigger picture, the issues of organizational culture, where DE&I have played a transformative role bringing about culture change. Although Rohini has a lot to share, she would really welcome questions, and so we encourage you to post them in the chat, and we will take as many of them as possible. She will take as many as possible before the close of the session. So here we go. Rohini, in your book, you mention organizations which have struggled with ensuring that their cultures, have tried to bring about DEI in an equitable and in a sustained way. Mm-hmm. I'd like you to elaborate for us on those 5 very elegant and succinct principles that you have, elaborated in your book. So would you like to use these and tell us how this happens?
Sure. Thank you very much, Paramita. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you. And thanks for inviting me. And thanks to you, Carsten, for both the podcast and for hosting this. So I really would love to make this a dialogue, and it would be great if you could put in the chat some questions that you have, because I love unexpected questions. So that would be great. And I know that Paramita is going to be scanning for those questions. And also any comments in terms of your own experiences, because you're all very experienced. So it would be great to hear how you handle similar situations. So yeah, you're right, Paramita, because I think, in the book I say that transformation happens at the intersection of the personal and the organization, or personal and systemic, if you will. So the systemic piece is absolutely critical, because for that sustained change, yes, you need to have the personal conviction and commitment and actions and behaviors, which you also have to impact the systems and processes, etc. And the 5 principles that you talk about, what I found, Paramita, is that there's really no sort of playbook, there's no quick checklist, and honestly, best practices are inadequate. So I recognize some of these sort of key principles, the 5 principles that you talk about, that provide a through line. And as you said, each principle is very simple. It's a simple statement, but it really is imbued with the fullness of my experiences, lessons learned, and those of my colleagues. They're simple, but they're very disruptive. And they're not designed to provide plug and play templates based on what's worked in the United States. And that's critical, because that's been one of the foundational mistakes of doing this work, is to replicate what's worked in one part of the world and apply it, elsewhere. But these can be applied to any culture with sensitivity, and it empowers global leaders to develop their own solutions and not to mimic any one experience. So here are the 5 principles, very briefly. The first one is make it local. And essentially there I talk about the fact that global DEI change has to be anchored in an understanding of the local context. It has to be informed by the history, the culture, the laws, the language of each place. And we have to really consider how identity is defined, how it's expressed, how it's perceived, and be aware of power dynamics and power structures, because there are always dominant and subordinate groups. They just differ depending on the context. So understanding the context is the first step in really finding strategies to advance underrepresented groups locally. But it really doesn't mean accepting the status quo, because outside influence can be catalyst for change. Outsiders can raise issues that sometimes insiders may not even see, or maybe, they may be very politically charged because of power dynamics. But it works best when local change agents are empowered to find the right entry point. So working with local change agents is absolutely critical. The second principle is what I call leaders change to lead change. And we all know that, and I'm sure all the best practices have committed leaders, inclusive leaders, because it's absolutely fundamental to sustain DEI change. When leaders truly embrace DEI with authentic purpose and passion, I think the organization goes from what I call performative action to sustainable progress. But leaders really need to internalize this benefit of DEI to themselves personally. And that requires a disruption of their worldview. And oftentimes it happens with the very painful work of introspection. So transformative leaders are those that combine sort of this inclusive mindset and behaviors with concrete specific actions, because personal behavior demonstrates conviction, but taking action really signals commitment. It requires intentionality to prioritize DEI as you would any other business imperative. The third principle is what I call, and it's good business too, and everyone on this call knows that without a compelling change narrative, 70% of change efforts fail. But this change narrative can't be siloed, it can't be bolted on. It really has to be congruent with an organization's purpose, how business is done, their mission, and regional trends. The fourth principle is go deep, wide, and inside out. And organizations are comprised of these interconnected systems that work in concert with each other, and DI needs to be infused into the processes, the policies, and structures. So we have to take a systems approach. So it requires sort of scaling wide through governance frameworks, deep, seeding local allies, and inside out by really integrating it both in the internal and external ecosystems. And the last principle, the fifth principle, is know what matters and count it. So metrics provide this sort of global framework and a cohesive narrative. They spotlight problem areas, but they also highlight possible solutions and the instruments for change. And they work best when they're aligned with the local context. But most importantly, managers, employees have to be held accountable. So those are the five principles: make it local, leaders change to lead change, and it's good business too. Go deep, wide, and inside out, and know what matters and count it. So I think all five of these have to work in concert with each other. There are these 5 levers that have to be pulled, depending on the stage and phase of the organization in order to really have sustained change. But you do need all 5.
Excellent. Sometimes, leaders with the very best of intentions can commit missteps, and especially when they take their program global, and you have given the large framework about the global local axis. But could you share maybe just one example of such a leader? And I'm conscious of time, so maybe one illustrative example before we go on to some of the deeper issues.
This is a tough call, but a good question. So I think the best example would be my own example, Paramita. And, one of the examples that I share, I'm kind of toggling between these 2 examples, but let me go to a different one. So when I first launched sort of global DEI work globally, I organized a meeting in Paris. And this was sort of a meeting with the senior most women in the organization, and the CEO personally invited them to attend. They attended from around the world. Many of the women who were European were very critical of the meeting. This was only senior women, and they felt that they had managed to overcome, any barriers, and therefore they really didn't feel that a special session focused on challenges encountered by them was necessary. Several of the senior women said that they would rather not be part of a meeting comprised only of women, and they only participated because they got a personal invitation from the CEO. Now, quite a few of the women were very clear that they were in their positions not because they were women, but because they had earned the job. And to be honest, I was frankly caught off guard. I was surprised by the resistance to a women's only body, as it was, perfectly acceptable in a US context at the time. So to me, this was an early lesson that I learned, a misstep that I made, which was not to assess situations with a limited one-dimensional worldview, because we frequently approach the work with our own limiting worldviews, which are quite antithetical to the very outcome that we're seeking. And I shouldn't have assumed that a women-only body would be embraced everywhere. So my misstep was really assessing the situation with this limited worldview and exporting what I thought had worked so well in the United States to other parts of the world. The fact that the women expressed resistance, they were doing so largely because, this was a very masculine culture, and they had to really demonstrate and prove that they were successful in a very masculine culture. So.
Okay. So this is continuing to put you a bit in the spot, but this is more about, the various dimensions.
Give me 1 second. I can
Yes,
hear some noise.
Sure.
Actually, this is all planned, and we use this time to, why don't we use this time to actually write the company that we work for into our name? That's a good practice for networking later.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
Just go back to the participant or teilnehmer and add your company to your name. The LC colleagues know that we put the LC company before our name so that we can also see who is who. Sorry, Rohini, I was just making use of the time. Back to you.
Okay. So, Rohini, among all the various issues that you've had to had to address globally, which one did you find the most challenging?
So I think there are 2, Paramita. One is issues of race and ethnicity, which are very challenging. And the second is addressing LGBTQ plus inclusion. And maybe I can talk about the LGBTQ plus inclusion at this point, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So, there are laws in over 70 countries that criminalize same-sex couples. And the question becomes, how do you advance LGBTQ plus inclusion when the laws are against it? And, I've said earlier also that understanding a local context doesn't mean that change agents simply accept the situation. We have to be willing to disrupt the status quo, and we can't back away from local challenges. So it is difficult. It has to be approached with sensitivity, but it's challenging. And I know that a lot of my LGBTQ plus colleagues would say, I'm not going to go to that part of the world because it's not safe for me. Yes, organizations basically say that, regardless of the laws in the country, our values trump, and those, that our workplaces are safe. But I think that, one has to it's incumbent on organizations to push for more. And I do think that organizations often have, particularly outsiders, have a freedom to raise issues that are difficult to push from the inside. And they can really make a positive difference. But as I said, it has to be, alongside local champions who know the right entry point, who know the pace of change. So one of the, there's an echo coming from Clemens. Okay, thank you. So one example that I have is in Singapore, where, Singapore is not a gay-friendly country. And Barclays and Google and several other multinational companies were the first corporate sponsors of Singapore's Pink Dot Festival. So they brought this to Singapore in celebration of the local LGBTQ community, their own community, and the broader community. So what these companies did, and this is what I mean by outsider sort of influence, they use their influence, they use their money to support local insider change agents from the LGBT community who are trying to carve out a safe space within their country. And by the time the government banned foreign organizations from sponsoring the Pink Dot Festival in 2017, actually, there was enough momentum that had built up that over 100 local companies were able to keep it going. So, similarly, I think global pride employee resource groups can spark change by bringing in cross-border ideas, best practices, as many LGBTQ employee resource groups did. For instance, in India, while same-sex relationships were illegal in India, it was the global pride groups that helped to really support the LGBTQ community in India, for example. So, but it's a difficult one, very difficult one to actually, address. And the other one I would say is race. I think you're muted, Paramita.
Trying to keep out all the interferences. Yes, as you did mention race and racism, I think for us as a European audience here, it would be interesting to know how can it be addressed without imposing a US framework?
Yeah, very, very challenging. And I think it's the most challenging to address globally. And to be honest, Paramita, my biggest regret is I didn't do it more substantively globally. It's very sensitive. It's politically charged, oftentimes talked about in code, not talked about at all. It's talked about, in terms of those employees or those youth in the suburbs without sort of mentioning race or ethnicity for reasons that I will talk about in a second. One of the ways that we found a good entry point in this conversation to chip away at this was through the refugee employment program, because providing jobs, expanding empathy at work is an entry point, because refugees come from visibly non-dominant groups, both in terms of ethnicity and religion, many of them. But I think we have to make more headway. And I realized I really wasn't alone, because I couldn't find any best practices in this space beyond the refugee space in Europe. And the reasons are that, race and racism is challenging because it's both universal. It exists regardless of where you are, just the dimensions differ. But it's very highly context specific. And each context has its own dominant and non-dominant groups that differ. So race and racism is fluid, and it's shaped by the culture, the history, and you can't use, as you said, that cookie cutter approach to dismantling racism, can't use a US lens. What's interesting is that it's often tangled up with ethnicity, with religion, with caste, which take on a much much more prominence than race does. In the US, the driving force, social force is race. And elsewhere in the world, it's one of the several identities that divide and play a less prominent role. So this intersectional identities becomes very important. And if we expect racism to be expressed in the manner that we're familiar with, let's say in the US, we're going to miss some very important entry points like discrimination against the lowest caste or religious minorities in India, or ethnic undertones and African politics. And honestly, in some parts of the world, it may be more appropriate to approach it through the lens of decolonization, like in APAC, right? Or the global North-South dynamics. And that may be a better way to approach issues of race, racism, dominant, non-dominant groups. And as I said, to complicate things further, race is highly emotive, politically charged, and and France is a clear example. So because I work for a French company, I'll give you an example from France. It's forbidden as in many parts of Europe to gather race or ethnicity data, and race was removed from the French Constitution in 2018. And this was in response to the persecution of Jewish people and an effort to rebuild after World War II. So France defined itself as indivisible. So you cannot identify people by community affiliation, but rather by objective criteria like migration, citizenship, because they don't want the state to use identity data for state action. So it makes sense. But how do you then address this topic, right? And I think right now there's an opening with the murder of George Floyd and protests all over the world, but clearly in Europe, from France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, UK, and everywhere else. It's opened up a space that was previously closed, and we need to enter that space. So we need to find the right entry points. And yes, you cannot gather data, but you can ask the questions. You can have the conversation. So for instance, in succession planning conversations, you'll typically hear, and this is what I've heard in European companies, we are very diverse. We have many nationalities. We have Belgians, we have French, we have Germans, we have Austrians, we have people from the Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, but the question to ask is, can you tell me, are these all white people? Are there any from other underrepresented ethnic minority groups? We know that there are Algerians, there are Tunisians, there are Moroccans in many of these countries. How many successors do you have in your talent pipeline that actually come from these groups? So nobody's saying you can't have the conversation. No one's saying you can't ask the questions. Yes, you can't gather the data, but there are ways of pushing it. If you are sensitive to the issues and believe that there is an issue where we need to really sort of push the status quo for change. So I hope that answers your question, Paramita.
It is absolutely. It's very complex, and thanks for summing it up so well. Again, I'm a bit conscious of time, so I might skip a question here, but you had mentioned that I'd like you to cite examples of some leaders who have disrupted their own worldview to emerge as inclusive, transformative leaders. And I remember you had an example which was from Germany, and I thought this would be particularly relevant to our audience. This was a gender case, if I recall.
Okay. Yeah. You're right. So, so let me just think through this. If I could just give two very quick examples.
Sure.
So you're right. I think, when leaders, when DI work is led by leaders who are transformative leaders, it can be sustained, and they've got to, as I said, disrupt their worldview, expand it. And sometimes it takes disruptive experiences and sort of the difficult work of introspection to get there. And, the murder of George Floyd in the US and this video was disruptive, and a lot of people who were on the sidelines all over the world became allies. But we can't obviously rely on these disturbing, breaking news events to create that transformation. So one of the examples I have, let me just share this one with you, is from the CEO of Sodexo, who's French. And I remember when I launched the global work, it was focused on gender. And he said to me, when I started talking about race and ethnicity, and he said to me, why are you diluting the focus on gender? That's where we are focused by bringing in issues of race and ethnicity. And so I realized, I mean, he was right. He's a French man, and I just, explained the context in France. So he was right from his context. But I realized that I had to expand his sort of worldview. Over 40% of the business was in the US. So I actually invited him to the African American Employee Resource Group meeting in Texas. He attended that meeting. He was one of 2 French men at that meeting, one of a handful of white men at that meeting. And the experience of being a minority, combined with listening to the lived experiences of people who he knew well, was very transformative. And he came away from that, quite with a new understanding. And I know that in succession planning meetings, he would ask different questions to tease out issues of ethnicity and race. After the murder of George Floyd, he sent a very heartfelt message to the organization, which he wouldn't have done had he not had that sort of transformative experience. So it's experiences and stories, not data, that often shifts perspectives. But I think we have to be mindful of the toll it takes on people to share their lived experiences. And we have to maximize each story's impact. And honestly, leaders have to take ownership of their own learning. So, but the German example that I shared with you, Paramita, very quickly, we had, and I think this is the one that I shared, we had one of our, the first gender meetings in Berlin. And I remember clearly this was a room full of women. And we put some of the leaders on the spot. We had them, build their own business case. This was 6 white German men, and they walked into the room and they had to present the business case. I don't think this was ever on their radar till that meeting, but they did it because these are senior women. Actually, one of the board members was there as well. So they were put on the spot. They had to actually think through and build a business case for why this is important. So they came and they presented, and it was such a sort of a disconnect, juxtaposition of women in these colorful suits and the men in identical blue suits, white shirts, all over 6 foot tall. So just the visual kind of juxtaposition was jarring. But they presented that business case. They, talked about it, never having done anything on this topic before. That was followed in the evening by a client meeting. So we had invited all the German clients to this meeting. We had a panel, and their clients, the, big clients like, Daimler, Mercedes, etc., were talking about some of what they were doing in this space. So they listened to what their clients were saying. And they had to then, the executive team, the CEO had to stand up and talk about Sodexo's commitment. So this was a very disruptive experience for that executive team. All of these, being minority in that room full of women, standing up and having to talk about their commitment to, to the public. Then you have to follow through. You have to live up to it. So I think that's another example of how one can sort of provide these sort of disruptive experiences to shift leaders' worldview. So they emerge with. Fast forward, we actually got a female CEO for Germany. The complexion, the demographics of that leadership changed dramatically, with over 30% women in that leadership team. So I'd like to say that particular experience in that meeting had some impact.
Lovely. And then maybe examples of how leaders can make the work local and yet push to disrupt the status quo, which means that making it local doesn't mean you have to accept inequities. I thought that would be a powerful example.
Mm-hmm. So I gave one example from Singapore. If it's okay, Paramita, can I give an example from Saudi? Would that
would be wonderful, even another part of the world.
Okay, so one of the leaders, actually a French leader, he was assigned to be country head in Saudi, and this was about the time when things were just opening up in Saudi, and the government was allowing women to work for multinational corporations. So he hired women and made all the accommodations for women. It was a separate room. You had to communicate through the intercom. If you had to enter, you had to have a Saudi male chaperone with you, etc. So over time, these women were highly ambitious. They wanted to advance their careers, and they needed to interact with men, outside of this sort of limited sphere. So they actually said, we've got to attend some of these meetings. And he said but the Saudi men said, you cannot without a chaperone. So this particular leader, he was gradually disrupting the status quo, first hiring women, making sure that it was local because all the accommodations were made. So he said to them, he said, look, you're welcome to attend every single meeting with them, but there's business to be done. They want to attend these meetings. They need the information, or the work is not going to get done. So the men basically said, well, we can't attend all the meetings, but what we can suggest, so these are the resistors, right? So they came up with a solution, and they said what we can suggest is, that they can meet in the office if the door is in an office, if the door is open and they're sitting at opposite ends of the desk. So simple solution, but he reached out, so he disrupted the status quo. He made it local, disrupted the status quo, and they came up with the solutions. And then of course I have the example about the mother-in-laws in India, but I'll save that for those who want to read the book.
Absolutely. That's a delightful one. If you were to give just one piece of advice for anyone in our gathering who is going to be doing DEI work globally, what would that be?
So I would say take time to listen, to build relationships with all the local stakeholders, find out who the stakeholders are, who the power brokers are, build those relationships, listen, understand the local context. And then I think it's really about sort of unpacking your data to see what you're solving for. Very often people put in place all these initiatives without knowing what they're solving for. So, look at your data, figure out the pain points, put in place initiatives, and then really embed, integrate, and hold your teams accountable. So I've gone back to the 5 principles.
Absolutely, I expected. And on the much broader picture for all of us, to ponder, to reflect on, what do you see as the future of DEI? And what is this moment calling for right now from all of us? What is our call to action at this point of time?
So the future, I think progress has been painfully slow. I think organizations are really failing to sustain DEI. Oftentimes it's other competing business priorities. It becomes a convenient excuse to dilute the focus. When we know that, focus on diversity can be the very thing that lifts organizations out of its challenges. And this is partly because, DEI is viewed as, incremental initiatives that can be dispensed with. And this was very true during COVID, because with the economic downturn, a lot of companies cut their DEI budgets. And then they had to deal with the disparate impact of the pandemic on women and marginalized communities. And then after Black Lives Matter going global, there was suddenly this accelerated need for organizations to double down. And performative statements were made, etc. So I think that, giving money is probably the easiest thing to do. Adding positions is important, but it's sort of a checklist, if you will. And the danger is feeling like it's enough when it really is not. And I think that, disruption of the status quo needs to become a normalized part of conversations in organizations. At the individual level, we've got to really figure out new ways of understanding identity and inequality. We've got to increase our understanding of intersectionality. At the organizational level, I think leaders have to eliminate those harmful practices that favor some, that have favored those that have benefited, right? So they have to disrupt those systems that have supported their success. And that's not easy because, and it's, what makes it sort of oppressive is because, the leaders don't even acknowledge what got them into those positions. And then more broadly, I think organizations need to take a stand, a daring, unequivocal stand on injustice in their communities. We've got to do that. We can't rely on governments. We've got to do that. So ultimately, as I said at the beginning, transformation happens at the intersection of the personal and the systemic. And it's really a very personal journey for each of us. So we have to examine our own, so the call to action is examine our own self-awareness and inclusive behaviors and actions, and use ourselves as instruments of change to be allies, because this work does happen one person at a time, in addition to the systems. And everyone on this call can be that ally that ignites that change. So that would be my call to action.
And I'm delighted that we have a question from Ilka from SAP. She's just raised her hand if you'd like to come up with your question. And then we have one more from our Inclusify community from Dorothy. So please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Paramita. And Rohini, I'm really impressed by how you're reflecting and showing us the passion for the topic, what you've done and the ideas that you've created. And I think you really set some major milestones in the industry as well. So thank you for sharing that. I have a question. Actually, I would have a couple of questions, but let me maybe take two out of them. What is, from your perspective, or how would you see a correlation by how much budget or what role plays budget when it comes to DE&I? Because that is, from my world, a major
Element.
And I would be interested in your perspective running that area for a large organization.
So Ilka, I would say, you're absolutely right. Very often what happens is you have a very tiny team, or sometimes even one individual, and this massive organization that the team or the individual is responsible for. So frequently those kinds of organizations is just to check the box. You've got a figurehead from a particular group just to say, I have somebody. Person cannot really have impact without the right positioning. So, where they are in the organization, and resources to support them. So I would say it is very important. But I'll say two things about that, Ilka. One is that, when I started off at Sodexo, I had one person reporting to me, and that was it. And that person was in compliance. But what happened was that, and I'll put a caveat to this, but what happened was that the organization actually saw the benefit to their business. And in seeing the benefit to the business, that support expanded, the resources expanded, because what we were able to show is that diversity became a differentiator for Sodexo. And I think I sort of talk about this a little bit, but basically, just to give you at a very high level. So as we cascaded what we were doing, our managers work out of SAP, for example. The SAP, like yourself or other CHRO, etc., would see what Sodexo was doing and the resources, and they said, "Wow, this is interesting. Can you share it with us?" Now, the manager, Sodexo manager who provides food service, is pretty low priority for the CEO of SAP. But diversity is a C-suite issue. So all of a sudden, this manager's profile was elevated at SAP. He or she realized, boy, this is great, because now I have a different way of building a relationship with the SAP leadership. So he or she, and very often was a white male, straight white male, became very involved in diversity because he saw that this would benefit the business. In doing that, so then they started reaching out to my team and saying, we're bidding for SAP. Can you provide us access? Can you help us? Because, so since we were seen as diversity leaders, Sodexo was, we would then help them to kind of broker an introduction. I mean, it's a B2B business, it's a client-based business, but I'm just giving you an example. So when that started happening, the resources also increased. So that's one point there. But I also think the other point that I'll make, Ilka, is that there are ways of tapping into resources in different pockets of the organization, even if one's budget is not that big. But I mean, I think it's incumbent on organizations to provide the resources like they would with any other. I mean, you don't do marketing with a skinny budget, right? I mean, if you say you're committed and this is important, it's a business priority, show us, put the resources. But I'm just saying that there are maybe a different way where you can tap into different pockets in the organization. So you don't have to own it, but you can partner with marketing, or you can partner with product development. And your role, or the diversity team's role, is to then pull it all together. So they own the product development, they own the marketing, but there's nobody there that's connecting the dots to see what is the red thread in diversity that's, across the organization, and pulling it all together to demonstrate the benefit and value of diversity to the entire organization, regardless of where it exists. And sometimes you have diversity councils, etc., that do that. I hope that's helpful, Ilka. I mean, apart from saying demand more money and trying to come up with other.
No, that's excellent. A wonderful example, Rohini. I know we're very conscious of time. Karsten, okay. I'm waving to you. Do we wind down here?
One more question.
One more question. There's a lovely question from Dorothy here.
Paramita, can I just make sure that Ilka is okay with what I said?
I am fine, and thanks for checking, Rohini. I think it's also a great opportunity for companies to network and collaborate, learn from each other.
Absolutely.
Cross industry, and
I think that's
bring
powerful.
In your clients, bring in your competitors, so they can, your executives can see what they're doing. So.
Yeah, and this is not about competition. This is about improving the world and help the world run.
Learning from each other's experiences. Yeah. So Dorothy has a very, very big question, which is about, how can we create disruptive experiences for those who are in the majority in a company? And I think you have some brilliant examples in your book, but if there's something you'd like to just touch upon, Rohini, for that, just
Yeah, I think, Dorothy, the example I gave about the French CEO, he was certainly the majority, right? Didn't quite recognize his privilege, but I think putting him in a situation where he was a minority, where he listened to the lived experiences of others, was really an important one. One other very quick example was one particular CEO who, did not buy the stats, the data, the business cases. He said, I have no time for this. I did realize that he wanted to network with other CEOs because this is a business opportunity for him. To your point, Ilka, about, bringing in other organizations. So he got involved in a cross-company mentoring program with other CEOs. He mentored a woman from a different company. She got laid off from that company. She shared her lived experiences with him about how difficult it was being the only woman in the C-suite, how she had been marginalized, what she experienced being let go. He came to me after that and he said, I had no idea. I could have shared all the data and stats and studies, and he was, to Dorothy's point, he was part of the majority. Said, I had no idea. And he said, what I want is for every one of my 12 direct reports to mentor/sponsor a woman from a different part of the company. They did. And of the 12, 9 went on to become CEOs, country heads, and to lead major pieces of business. So giving those experiences very often, but I will again caution that you have to be careful because it takes a toll on people who are sharing their lived experiences again and again. And use it with discretion and, really maximize the impact. So thanks for the question, Dorothy.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I think this has been incredibly rich in such a short time. I mean, and I would really urge those of you who are keen to hear more of those stories and those experiences and how they link in with those principles. It's a very, very rich book, and I really recommend it very, very warmly. So I'm handing back to our Master of Ceremonies, Karsten.
So, what do you think? After the initial keynote, we had a couple of fireside chats where individual companies shared their stories, shared their best practices, what worked, what didn't work, and we had a very lively discussion also with the audience. What are your experiences with regards to diversity, with equity and inclusion in your particular organization, in your team? How do you manage it? How do you address it? Is this something that is bothering you? Is this something that's on your agenda? Or is this something that is not anything close to your heart? Let us know your thoughts. Let us know your feedback. Please leave us a note in the comment function or send us a note, an email at leaderstalk@leadership-choices.com. We are looking forward to hearing from you. And now, all the best and stay healthy, and hear you next time. Bye for now.
This was an episode of Leaders Talk, the interview podcast portraying leaders who are committed to better leadership, better organizations, and a better world, powered by Leadership Choices. If you want to give us feedback, please send an email to leaderstalk@leadership-choices.com. Thank you for listening.